Okay, in this presentation we'll take a look at an extract from Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar. It was chosen recently by a student to use for an unseen literary text practice. The extract is about a side of A4 long and comes right at the end of chapter 13. It begins with the narrator tugging on her veil and striding through the wrought iron gates as she prepares to visit the grave of her father for the first time. As she passes through the gates, the narrator experiences a range of emotions concerning her father. Her own memories, her thoughts, her feelings seem to conflict with her mother's values in particular. Not only that, the neglected state of the graveyard seems to echo her own neglect for her father. And then finally she finds herself by his grave and is overwhelmed by the sense of loss and the raw emotion that she feels. A good way into an extract is to annotate the journey through the conflict or the tension within the text. Let's go through the 6 types of conflicts conventionally listed in literature. The classic first-person narrator conflict is self against self or person against self. The character struggles with their values throughout the course of the story. This is certainly true for Esther in The Bell Jar, but it's also true for characters in third-person narratives. Raskolnikov, for instance, in Crime and Punishment, struggles with overwhelming guilt after murdering a pawnbroker. And in Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Stevenson externalizes the conflict by making them into 2 separate characters. The person versus person conflict is often found in the struggle of values in the protagonist-antagonist conflict. This dates right back to the Warring Brothers story of Cain and Abel, and it's also a staple of superhero comics. You can find it in Batman and Joker, Superman and Lex Luthor. In literature, it's in Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty, for example. Person versus society struggle is the fundamental struggle in dystopian novels. Winston Smith's struggle in 1984 would be an example of this. V's struggle in V for Vendetta. Baldwin in his essays depicts the struggle for civil rights for black Americans in the 50s and 60s. If we move on to nature, person versus nature, then Jaws would be a great example of this. You can see Jaws represents the unknown and the destructive power of the unknown. Person versus technology is a staple of the sci-fi genre. And then the person versus gods is very much in evidence in classical literature. Oedipus trying to outrun his fate would be a good example of this. Romeo and Juliet calling themselves star-crossed lovers would be another example. So if we go through this extract, let's see if we can find evidence of conflict and a journey through that conflict in the text. So I tugged my black veil down to my chin and strode in through the raw iron gates. On a literal level, the black veil is just a piece of lace. On a figurative level or a symbolic level, it represents the turning away from outward society and looking inward. And it represents a period of mourning. So when the narrator pulls that black veil down, symbolically she's entering into mourning. She strides through the gates, and that's quite enthusiastic. And the gates themselves, the raw iron gates, not only represent the entrance to the graveyard and the boundary of the graveyard, they represent the boundary to which this character has travelled up to so far in terms of her emotional or psychological grief. She's never gone past this point. She states, none of us had ever visited him. My mother hadn't let us come. So immediately we can see that the mother is being set up as the antagonist here. She's preventing the grief from finding its expression and from preventing the children from integrating their loss into their characters. And as a result of this, at the end of the paragraph, the narrator says, his death had always seemed unreal to me. It's almost got a fantasy quality to it, and we'll see that it gets explored as the extract continues. The loss has not been integrated into the narrator's character. As Plath continues, we see that she's had a great yearning to pay my father back for all the years of neglect and start tending his grave. The yearning is the motive that is driving her forward and sending her into the graveyard to search for him. And there's a sort of balance here. The years of neglect are going to be paid back by tending his grave. And it's almost as if the tending of the grave is not only going to bring the ground back to some sort of order, it's saying of her own potential redemption that this activity is going to instill. I'd always been my father's favourite, and it seemed fitting that I should take on a mourning my mother had never bothered with. The fact that she's her father's favourite in a group of siblings is a little bit disconcerting, but the fact that she mentions her mother in the same sentence seems to suggest that she is her father's favourite, full stop. And that would really be part of the pathology of the family, and maybe the reason why the mother never bothered with mourning. After this, the narrator begins to discuss almost an idealized version of what she believes her father and her relationship would have been like. He would have taught me all about insects. He would have taught me German, Greek and Latin. So it seems that the time and attention that the father had would be lavished upon the narrator. The mother, however, said that describes the father, according to the narrator, as a bitter atheist. In this particular extract, if anyone is coming across as bitter, it's the mother, as portrayed by the narrator here. The narrator's own neglect for her father's grave is then compounded by the graveyard itself. As she steps into the graveyard and starts to walk around, she's looking for his father's grave, and it disappointed me. It was like a rubbish dump, the smell of stagnant salt. So her own neglect for the father's grave is compounded by society's neglect for the graveyard. It stinks and it looks like a rubbish dump. Whatever romantic notions of death that the narrator may have had, Plath dispels them here. There's nothing romantic about this. It's not the sweet black veil that you pull over the face. There's something repugnant about it. I couldn't find my father anywhere. So in this part is a single line paragraph, and it's not just about a daughter looking for her father's grave with the thought of tending to that grave. It's a child searching for her father. And I think that the one line paragraph makes it particularly poignant. She's never grieved for him. His death is unreal to her. She's caught in this twilight zone of seeking a fantasy of a father and not being able to find him. Now, after that, there is a paragraph where the clouds gather and the drizzle comes, and then I saw my father's gravestone. It's almost, Plath is using the pathetic fallacy here to capture the grey mood of the narrator. And then in finding the father's gravestone, the narrator's journey in the graveyard reaches a complex. Plath has written it again as a one-line paragraph to emphasise the emotional significance. At the foot of the stone, I arranged the rainy armfuls of azaleas I had picked from a bush at the gateway of the graveyard. Now, I think here Plath portrays her narrator as underprepared physically and unprepared emotionally. Although she wears a veil and she strode through the gates, she picked the flowers en route. It's almost an afterthought. She's underprepared, and when she arrives at the gravestone, my legs folded under me and I sat down in the sopping grass. I couldn't understand why I was crying so hard. The verb folded here suggests that she collapses. And the fact that she couldn't understand why she collapses and why she's crying so much suggests that she's actually disconnected from the visceral grief of her body. She's unprepared emotionally for what she's about to experience. Then I remembered that I had never cried for my father's death. I think this sort of sums up the disconnect, the schism between the emotional life of the narrator and the mental life of the narrator. The two things are not connected. She has to actively remember that she's not grieved over her father. My mother hadn't cried either. She had just smiled and said what a merciful thing it was for him he had died. So the mother's become, again, the antagonist, or at least the role model for a bad form of grieving, which seems to be a form of repression that the narrator's carried around with her. Because if he had have lived, he would have been crippled and an invalid for life. Now, this applies to the father's state, according to the mother, but in a wider context, it also applies to the mother's emotional state and the narrator's emotional or psychological state. The extract ends with, I laid my face to the smooth face of the marble and howled my loss into the cold salt rain. Through the repetition of face, it sounds as if father and daughter have been reunited face to face. It is, however, only the marble that she's hugging. The verb howled here, used by Plath, makes her narrator sound like a dog or a wolf. There's something primal about it. Esther is experiencing her emotions raw, and this could in some way signify part of the healing process. I howled my loss into the cold salt rain. Well, actually, rain is not salty. Tears are salty. And so by combining the two, Plath blurs the distinction between Esther and the environment. I think this magnifies the narrator's loss. So if we go back to our wheel of conflict, let's see which elements of conflict are involved in this extract. Well, there's certainly person versus self. Esther's at odds with her own emotions. There's schism between her mental attitude and her emotional life. And there seems to be, to an extent, person versus person, or at least the portrayal of her mother as told by the narrator. The mother seems to be set up as the antagonist in this particular piece. I think it'd be too strong to claim person versus society. So although there is a neglect of the graveyard, that compounds the same way that Esther feels. So they're almost in harmony or working in tandem rather than against each other. And I wouldn't necessarily consider that there are any of the other three. So let's see if we can put this together and see what it might look like in an essay. So in this extract, Plath has a narrator enter new territory, physically and emotionally. So I'm stating it literally, and then I'm extending it out, the new territory, to be emotional territory as well. As she searches for her father's resting place in an overgrown graveyard, she searches for her own redemption. That's my claim, my thesis statement through the journey that she is going on. In doing so the journey makes her confront her own neglect of her father, her mother's seeming indifference towards him, and finally she experiences overwhelming grief. So those are the stages of the journey. And if I was to put that into paragraphs, I might begin the topic sentences as thus. In this extract, the narrator embarks on a journey towards redemption. In putting on the veil, she symbolically turns inwards, away from society, and as she passes through the wrought iron gate, she moves physically and emotionally into new territory. And then I'll just give evidence of that. The second paragraph, I might begin like this. In resolving to tend the grave, Plath's narrator confronts her own and her mother's neglect of her father's final resting place and their very different attitudes towards his death and his memory. And then I'd have to explain what those different attitudes are in the paragraph. And then I may continue the argument as follows. When she finally finds his grave, the narrator is overwhelmed by her grief. Here Plath explores the sense of raw loss associated with the death of a loved one and the need to integrate it rather than repress it. And I think that is what will lead the character on the path to redemption. I want you to note that I mention Plath constantly in the paragraphs there because it's Plath that's doing it, and not to get confused by the narrator and the author. Well, I hope you found that helpful. Thank you ever so much. This is Think, 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 thanking you.